You wake to the faint rustle of silk brushing stone, the perfume of jasmine curdling with something metallic beneath it. Somewhere beyond the gilded screens, a single sound, half gasp, half prayer, echoes through a palace built to muffle screams. You are inside Topkapi, where beauty was not a luxury, but camouflage. Before we descend into this hidden world, take a moment to breathe. History like this rarely reaches the light. If you're watching from Istanbul, Delhi, London, or somewhere halfway between, tell me where this story finds you tonight. The fact that voices from every corner of the world can meet here, unearthing what centuries of silence tried to bury, is nothing short of extraordinary. So, if you're ready, let's step into the quiet heart of an empire that taught the world how to hide cruelty behind a curtain of silk. The year is 1648. The Ottoman Empire stretches from the Balkans to the Arabian deserts, but the true power of the dynasty beats inside a single marble labyrinth overlooking the Bosphorus. Topkapi Palace, shimmering under the glow of oil lamps, was both a fortress and a dream. To the poets, it was a heaven of tulips and moonlight. To those who lived within its harem walls, it was a theater of whispers, each corridor a sentence, each locked door a verdict. Sultan Ibrahim Fifirn ruled in name, but his mind was a storm. Court chroniclers called him Deliler Padishah, the mad Sultan. Yet madness in his reign was not merely a symptom, it was policy. In his world, paranoia was the foundation of power, and in the harem, where hundreds of women lived in perfumed captivity, paranoia became a religion. They said the Sultan loved two things: the scent of musk and the sound of obedience. He would walk barefoot through the harem gardens at night, his steps muffled by Persian carpets, listening for the silence that told him no one dared to breathe without his will. The harem was governed not by desire, but by discipline, a political organism designed to serve as the empire's most private court. Every concubine was trained in ritual: when to bow, when to speak, how to fall gracefully if summoned. Amid this world of ritualized beauty lived a woman named Aishi Hatun. Venetian envoys described her as the Whisperer, a favorite whose laughter could quiet the Sultan's temper. But one winter evening, Aishi vanished without record. Her quarters were cleared before dawn, her name erased from the duty rolls, her attendants reassigned as if she had never existed. In the weeks that followed, a chill fell over the harem. Servants carried water in silence, eunuchs moved like shadows, and a single rumor pulsed through the marble halls, that Aishi had been taken to the cafes, the cage. It was said to be a private wing where disobedient consorts were retaught loyalty. No one who entered was ever seen again. Yet the paradox of the harem was this: for all its secrecy, it recorded everything. Inside the imperial archives, chroniclers logged even the Sultan's moods with bureaucratic precision. A note from 1648 survives, faded ink on lambskin parchment. It reads, "The rose is withered for disfavor. A replacement shall be chosen before the new moon." The phrase sounds poetic, but palace scholars knew its code. The rose was Aishi's title. Withered meant she was gone. Outside the harem walls, Istanbul's streets pulsed with song and trade, oblivious to the quiet terror unfolding above them. To the world, the Ottoman court was still the envy of civilization. Its fountains, its libraries, its celestial observatories a symbol of divine order. But inside Topkapi, order was a mask stretched over fear. The Sultan's mother, Kosem Sultan, ruled the harem with an iron hand disguised in silk. It was she who decided which concubines would rise, which would vanish, and which would be remembered only as metaphors in the empire's poetry. One night, a palace laundress claimed she heard singing from beneath the marble floor of the harem baths. The melody was faint, carried through the stone itself. When she pressed her ear to the tiles, she swore she heard words. A prayer, half sung, half wept, in a voice she recognized. Aishi's. The eunuch overseer dismissed it as superstition, but that night the laundress was reassigned to the kitchens and never returned to the bathhouse again. Historians would later describe the harem as an institution of grace and refinement. They spoke of education, music, and the arts. But those who scrubbed its floors, who carried its secrets in silence, remembered something else, the sound that sometimes rose beneath the silk. In time, the empire forgot Eshi Hatun. Her portrait was painted over, her name replaced in the registers by another. Yet in the quiet hours before dawn, servants whispered of her fate. Some said she drowned, others that she still sang beneath the marble, her voice seeping through the cracks when the lamps burned low. The harem's power lay not in what it revealed, but in what it erased. And as the empire's grandeur gleamed brighter than ever, its most terrible truths were buried just as deep. Because in Topkapi, beauty was not the opposite of cruelty. It was its disguise. In the archives of the Ottoman Empire, cruelty was not chaos. It was calligraphy. Every punishment, every execution, every disappearance inside the palace walls was inked in neat, deliberate Arabic script, filed among tax records and grain inventories. To the bureaucrats of Topkapi, death was simply another administrative task and suffering another number to be balanced in the ledgers of empire. For all its grandeur, the Ottoman court functioned on paper. Orders were stamped, sealed, and carried across continents by riders and pigeons. But the most chilling documents were never meant to leave the palace. Inside the Mihim Defteri, the Imperial Register of Affairs, one can still find lines written in a clerk's precise hand. Punishment carried forth in accordance with silence, the subject restored to calm waters. To modern eyes, it reads as poetry. To those who lived it, it meant drowning. Drowning was not chosen for spectacle. It was chosen for silence. The Bosphorus, the strait that divided continents, also divided life from death for countless women accused of treachery, sorcery, or sedition. The punishment was called chuvalamak, to be sacked. Women of rank were placed in leather sacks weighted with stones, the mouths sewn shut before dawn. Yet even this horror was recorded with the sterile detachment of a census. A clerk would note the day, the moon phase, the number of attendants present, and finally the phrase, "justice completed without disorder." A Venetian ambassador once wrote, "I have seen death in war, but never so organized as here." His dispatches, smuggled through Galata under the cover of night, described executioners who moved like accountants, men whose hands bore the stains of both ink and blood. They were servants of order, not emotion. Each wore dark linen robes without insignia. They were forbidden to speak the names of the condemned, for even the utterance of a traitor's name could corrupt the purity of the record. In one surviving testimony, an executioner's apprentice recalls his first assignment, a concubine accused of spying for the Venetians. Her sentence had already been signed by the Sultan's seal, a tulip-shaped insignia pressed in crimson wax. The master executioner spoke only once. Let the record be clean. The woman was led through a torchlit corridor, the air thick with the scent of oil and salt. Outside, the Bosphorus churned in darkness, its tide whispering against the stone embankment. The apprentice remembered how she tried to pray but could not find the words. It was not the water that took her breath, he wrote, but the silence. The bureaucracy of pain was not confined to the sea. Beneath the marble courtyards of Topkapi, chambers existed that never appeared on any plan. Excavations in the early 20th century revealed narrow cells lined with copper hooks, drain holes cut into the floor, and a pulley system attached to the ceiling beams. Yet, what struck archaeologists most was the craftsmanship, the symmetry, the precision. Torture here was engineered, not improvised. Every inch of stone reflected a mind trained to measure suffering in degrees and minutes. How does a civilization that built mosques, like poems and libraries filled with galaxies, also build instruments of torment so deliberate, so mechanical? The answer lies in the Ottoman devotion to hierarchy. Every act had a protocol. Every punishment a procedure. Even pain required paperwork. The chief executioner, known as Bostanchabasha, was required to submit an after-action report describing the state of the body and demeanor of the condemned. It was reviewed by the Grand Vizier, then sealed into archives where no ordinary scribe could ever look upon it again. In the harem, these punishments became legend, whispered warnings disguised as stories. Servants spoke of the Silent Garden, a small courtyard where condemned women were said to walk one final time among the cypress trees before their sentencing. The path was paved with white marble, its veins stained faintly red. When the wind passed through the trees, the leaves sounded like a woman's sigh. But the most haunting evidence of all came not from the palace, but from the pens of outsiders. Venetian merchants, forbidden from entering Topkapi, often bought fragments of parchment from Istanbul's scrap markets, discarded bits of old state documents sold as wrapping paper. One merchant in 1657 unrolled a sheet and found the words, "Drowned for the good of silence." The handwriting was fine, almost graceful. He kept the paper as a curiosity and later sent it to Venice, where it now lies in a private archive. The ink faded, but the phrase is still legible, a relic of cruelty disguised as order. The cruelty of the empire was not hidden in shadowy chambers alone. It lived in the sunlight, stamped, catalogued, archived. Each act of violence transformed into a bureaucratic entry, a sentence that stripped emotion from the act. The empire's greatness depended on its capacity to make suffering procedural, and yet, within this machinery, something human still flickered. Among the records of the drowned, one line stands out, an anomaly. It reads, "The condemned was pardoned by the tide." No historian can explain it. Perhaps the scribe pitied her. Perhaps she escaped. Or perhaps, in a rare act of rebellion, the tide itself refused to obey. But the harem would remember. Whispers of that night moved like breath beneath the marble floors, proof that even in the empire's most perfected silence, the sea still spoke. When the workmen first broke through the eastern wall of Topkapi Palace, they expected to find pipes, not bones. It was the spring of 1923, and the air in Istanbul was thick with dust and revolution. The Ottoman Empire had collapsed months before, and the city was now a living ruin of vanished empires and shifting names. Among the debris of a dynasty, a French archaeological team led by Henri Prost uncovered a sealed chamber, a cavity no larger than a monk's cell. Inside, they found skeletons pressed against the stone, their arms raised, their fingers clawing at the wall. Prost wrote in his field diary, "They died standing." He noted the scratches etched into the mortar, letters that almost formed words, and one phrase repeated again and again in Ottoman Turkish, "Still here." The discovery should have changed everything. But within weeks, the chamber was quietly resealed. The official report filed to Ankara mentioned only structural irregularities. The photographs vanished into the archives of the French Academy, never to be published. It was not the first time the palace had buried its past, and it would not be the last. When the Ottomans fell, they left behind not just a broken empire, but a mountain of documents, millions of pages chronicling 5 centuries of rule. Yet whole categories disappeared before historians could even touch them. Records of the harem punishments, the secret tribunals, the executioner's ledgers, all gone. Some were burned in the chaos of occupation. Others were sold by desperate scribes to foreign collectors. But a few, scholars now suspect, were deliberately erased. To understand why, one must look not to Istanbul, but to Europe. By the mid-19th century, the West had built its own mythology around the Ottoman world, a fantasy of silks and shadows, of odalisques reclining in perfumed languor. French painters like Ingres and Gérôme immortalized this image, filling canvases with half-naked women and latticed screens. The harem was no longer a site of power or politics, it was a stage set for the European imagination. Behind the brushstrokes lay something colder: propaganda. The Orientalist vision turned cruelty into spectacle and erased the machinery of control that made it real. In letters unearthed from the British Museum's restricted collections, there are glimpses of how this erasure was engineered. In 1889, a scholar named Sir William Muir wrote to a French colleague, "We must not indulge the barbarities of the Turk with the dignity of record. Better they remain the whispers of bazaars than the chronicles of empire." His words reveal the quiet calculus of history writing. To shape the East as backward was to sanctify the West as modern. The more monstrous the Ottoman became in myth, the more humane Europe appeared by contrast. Yet the irony is cruel. At the very moment European historians condemned Ottoman barbarism, their own empires were refining brutality into science. In Algeria, French officers perfected the art of psychological torture. In India, British prisons experimented with sensory deprivation. Spanish colonial forces in the Philippines walled rebels alive in stone cells eerily similar to those beneath Topkapi. The horror was not unique. It was universal, but to admit that would mean confessing the shared sins of civilization. And so, Europe rewrote the Ottoman record, transforming systematic cruelty into exotic legend. By the time Turkish historians like Halil İnalcık began combing through the remnants of imperial archives in the 1950s, much had already vanished. He spoke of finding fragments, execution orders used as scrap paper, a royal decree cut into strips to bind a book's spine. Among the surviving pages, İnalcık discovered correspondence between 19th-century Ottoman officials and European scholars negotiating which histories would be translated, which would be forgotten. One letter from an Ottoman minister reads, "If they must print our empire in their languages, let them print it beautiful." The conspiracy was not simply Western, it was reciprocal, an unspoken pact between empire and observer. The Ottomans wished to be remembered for their art, their architecture, their order. The Europeans wished to remember them as barbaric but picturesque. Both found comfort in selective memory, and between them the bones beneath the palace were left to silence. In 1965, a team of Turkish restorers accidentally rediscovered Prost's sealed chamber. This time, the remains were documented properly. Forensic specialists determined that the victims had been walled up alive sometime in the late 17th century. The marks on the bones told a story of slow suffocation and madness. One skull bore deep indentations in the teeth, as if the victim had bitten the wall until death. Yet the true horror was in the discovery that someone, decades or even centuries later, had reopened the chamber, removed certain bones, and resealed it again. The intrusion was deliberate. Someone had tried to curate the evidence of cruelty, deciding which fragments of truth would survive. When these findings were finally published, they caused only a brief ripple. Europe had long moved on, its museums still hung with Orientalist fantasies, its schoolbooks still echoing the tale of a decadent East rescued by progress. The photographs of the chamber gathered dust in an Istanbul archive. The story faded once more. History, it seems, has its own executioners. They wear no hoods, wield no blades. They redact, they translate, they omit. In the great libraries of the world, violence dies not by sword, but by silence. Today, when historians speak of the romantic harem, few recall the rooms beneath it, the ledger of drownings, the cages of hooks, the walled crypt where voices were entombed. Those bones are more than relics. They are indictments. They whisper that empire, any empire, survives by deciding which sufferings are worth remembering and which must be buried. As dusk falls over the Bosphorus, tourists still walk the polished floors of Topkapi Palace, their laughter echoing through the same corridors where screams once lived. They photograph the tiles, the fountains, the embroidered screens. None notice the faint unevenness in one wall near the eastern wing. The plaster there sounds hollow when tapped. Some say, on certain nights, when the tide presses against the shore and the wind runs through the cypress trees, you can hear something faint behind that wall, a slow, rhythmic scratching, like nails against stone. The empire may be gone, but its silences are still alive.